The next couple of tools we have in our arsenal of selection tools is the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. So this is going to be the fourth icon down on the tools bar, and you can see that the shortcut key for them is W. So the quick selection tool is an amazing tool that allows us to make selections based on pixel information, and it's going to just allow us to quickly select items in our scene. So for instance, we have this car here, and it's going to use a brush to do this. So we just have a basic brush, and so the selections you make is going to be dependent on the brush that you use. But we'll start off with a big brush, and if I just start clicking on this car, you can see right away what happens. It starts guessing at the selections that we want to make, and it does a really good job of finding out where the pixels end and begin based on the background. So there I ran off a little bit, and you can see it grab that brown background, and as we get around these reflections in the darker areas, it's going to have a harder time guessing that information. But as far as the blue car went, it did a really quick and easy job of making this selection, and I can go in here and fine-tune this if I need to. Now, in the past, making these selections might have taken a long time. I could use the lasso tool, but I would have to freehand the whole thing. I could use the magnetic lasso tool, which would do a pretty good job, but I would still have to clean it up. This is a quick and easy way to go in here and start making these selections. Just like with other selection tools, I can subtract and add by using the Shift and the Alt keys. So if I hold down, well, I don't need to hold down the Shift, it'll automatically add for me unless I change the brush back to the regular selection brush up here. Now, if I hold down Shift, it'll add. And if I hold down Alt, it will subtract. If I don't have anything and I click, it will drag the selection around. So that's not something we want to do. So typically I leave it on the plus and I just use the Alt or the Option key to subtract. So if I want to get rid of this, I can subtract this out. I might need to say zoom in, and then we can decrease our brush size, and then we will sample a little less and have an easier time getting exactly what we need here. But it's going to have a tricky time getting around some of these edges, so we'd have to spend some time going through and cleaning this up and doing the best that we can to really make those selections. But it's based on the brush that we're using here, so we can use different brushes, the hardness, the size, the spacing, to actually get different selections. Some other options that we have at the top is sample all layers. So if this was copy and pasted onto a separate layer, and then we had two layers, you could sample both of those layers together. That might be something that you need to sample across two layers if you need to in your document. And then there's auto enhance. This just says it's going to try to pick the best edge possible for you. I don't know if I've really even ever turned it on. It usually does a pretty good job, but you might want to experiment because it's going to try its hardest to calculate a little more and figure out that edge for you. And then finally, we have some other selection options, select subject and select mask. We've seen select subject before by going to select and then down to subject. It's also listed here. If we hit Control D and deselect and we hit that button, it's going to try to figure out what the subject of this image is and make that selection. This does really great with things that have a main focal point, or especially with people. So as you can see here, it went and tried to guess the selection. It wasn't perfect. It brought in some of this blue because the blue matches the car, but we can just go ahead and deselect that with our tool. So that is the quick selection tool. It's an amazing tool. It works really well. But before the quick selection tool came around, we had the magic wand tool. This was one of the first tools I remember using in Photoshop where I was just like, man, this is a really cool tool. And this takes a sample and uses a tolerance. So here at the top you can see we can also add and subtract and do all those great things with selections. But here we can select different samples, and the sample is going to be basically how far out it's going to radiate a sample to create a selection based on the pixels. So we'll look at that here in a minute. Then we have our tolerance. This is going to be the range of when you're sampling a color, how much it wants to pick outside of that range. We have anti-aliasing, contiguous, and then sample all layers, and then select subject and select a mask also. So let's just do point sample and do a tolerance of 16. I'm going to select the blue, and it's going to select all the blue until it finds an unlike color, so the silver, and then it's going to stop. But if I hold down Shift, I can keep selecting, and when I select a piece such as blue, it'll select pixels around that. Now this doesn't look really great because our point sample and our tolerance is really low. So let's go ahead and deselect that, and let's crank up this sample size here. And now when I select, you can see it's picking a bigger sample selection. So by doing so, we can pick a bigger sample, but then we can run into this problem where it saw some dark pixels and then dark pixels in these trees and pick them also. So we might run into that issue, and we need to find the balance. Usually I use a point sample and I mess with the tolerance and just add in more as I need to. So if we have a very low tolerance like 1, it's not really going to pick anything but 1 pixel. Let's say we move it to 4, you can see it's not really picking much here. We can do 16. It's now picking a higher tolerance of pixels. And if I hold Shift, I can keep adding. This is typically what I used to do in Photoshop, was just click like this until that quick selection tool came along. It made it so much easier. But if we pick a higher tolerance, let's say we pick like 60 and we select that door, you can see it's picking a lot more of a range here. So we need to find, the sweet spot of this image, because there's some dark areas here and then we have these shadows. It has a hard time figuring those out. So we might mess around with the tolerance a little bit until we get it down to just that blue color of where we want it to be. So this 20 seems to work good here. I'll hold Shift, and now I can click in these places that don't have any selection made and add those in as I see fit, and then I can also subtract those samples also. So you're going to be able to select with the magic wand based on a sample, whereas the quick selection tool finds differences in pixels and allows you to just click and drag and start selecting. I used to use the magic wand tool all the time. Now I find myself hardly using it, and I usually use the quick selection tool more often because I just find it works a little better the way that they've changed those tools. But those are how they work. They're more selection tools for you and just gives you more of a chance to fine-tune your selections in your designs or your photos.